Morning, Helen and Elaine, and thank you for being with us. And I mean, I was going to say, while I appreciate your honesty, you are painting a very dismal picture, but if it needs to be said, it needs to be said, and if that's the harsh reality, I think we all need to hear that. I think we all welcome the Good Friday Agreement and you know what it did achieve, a relative peace, but as you're pointing out, there's an awful lot of work not done that needs to be done to actually truly integrate the people in the North and, you know, to create a brighter future and a spectrum of issues. And I mean, some of the issues you've highlighted, you know, we encounter here in South as well, unfortunately, you know, around gender-based violence, around, you know, inadequate childcare, obviously the homeless crisis. So there's a lot of issues that there's commonality, and that, you know, maybe, as we said, looking at it in a shared way and building a new or a better Ireland of some sort is the way to go forward, and that's why we're having these discussions. You both mentioned the Civic Forum, and I'm wondering maybe you would just expand on that a little bit there. I mean, you know, you said it was hard fought for at the time, and it's just to explain exactly why it was established, the work it carried out, why it was ended, and is there a possibility of it being re-established? What would it take to actually re-establish it? Because I think, you know, from what I do know of it, it'd be very important in kind of creating integration among the people and addressing the issues. As you said, there's a lot of segregation still. Also, Bill of Rights, you mentioned as well, which is extremely important part of the Good Friday Agreement, which hasn't been actually fully realised or implemented. And there would be concern there that since Brexit, the rights guaranteed under the EU are no longer guaranteed to the people of the North, so they're going to see a widening of rights. So just even to say, where are we at with that? Is there any hope of a Bill of Rights? And just you mentioned a petition of concern. I don't understand what that is. Just even what that is. What was its intended use, and how is it being misused? So just first.
So the petition of concern, first of all, is a mechanism that was brought in the St Andrews Agreement of 2007, and its purpose is it's really almost operates a bit like a veto. But it has to be signed by a certain number of MLAs, and its purpose is to stop legislation that would have an undue impact on one community or the other. So its intention was to stop something that might have a sectarian outcomes, but it's used in reality for really anything that a government doesn't like. So things like there was a vote on same-sex marriage that was passed by a majority of MLAs, and a petition of concern was used to stop it. Now, there's no obvious reason why same-sex marriage would have an undue impact on one or the other community, but it was used that way. Now, there are many, many other examples, but that's a very obvious one. So its intention was to prevent discrimination, and actually it's being used almost in the opposite way, to effect discrimination. And to frustrate the majority of the MLAs. And that's why we ended up with same-sex marriage coming through Westminster. And in terms of the Bill of Rights, on the plus side, what we have post-Brexit, I mean, there's very few pluses about Brexit, but the Windsor Framework Agreement, as well as the protocol that preceded that, has a provision, Article 2 of that, says that citizens in Northern Ireland should not experience a diminution of rights, and that we should keep pace with rights in the European Union. Now, the actual operation of that is a different thing, but in reality what that has meant, for example, is our Human Rights Commission in Northern Ireland has brought the UK government to court over a recently passed piece of legislation on migration, which is the mechanism they're using to allow them to deport people to Rwanda, or attempting to do that. And the court case has found that, in fact, that does not apply in Northern Ireland because of the Article 2 no diminution of rights provisions. So it's actually being used through the courts to fight legislation coming from the UK and to protect the rights of people within Northern Ireland. Now, in practice, what that also means is any legislation coming out of the EU that should apply across all citizens of the EU then has to be incorporated into one or several government departments in Stormont. For example, we're getting the Pay Transparency Directive later in the year, and that's going to be in some way enacted in Stormont. Now, the in some way is where, you know, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. Will it be with the Department for the Economy? Will it be with the Department for Communities, which for specific reasons, but not obvious ones, is the department with responsibility for equalities? You know, it's one of those ones where if it gets split up, it could lose its impact. So we've yet to see how that's going to pan out, but it is, in theory, our Assembly keeping up with the rights-based provisions of the European Union. So that is one plus out of all of this. Okay. In terms of the Bill of Rights, there was a lot of work done in the last mandate, so the one that ended in the summer of 2022, around a Bill of Rights. And they had an ad hoc committee and they worked quite hard to have what would be a draft Bill of Rights. But it was blocked by mainly by the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, but it was simply seen as something that was a nationalist kind of or other project, and effectively blocked by unionists who various political unionist parties don't seem to have bought in to the understanding that rights are for everyone, and that the Bill of Rights will protect them and their rights, including their cultural rights, as much as it would protect anybody else. But it seems to be one of those many things in Northern Ireland that for no apparent reason is politicised along orange and green lines. And I don't see us adopting that. Now, of course, it could be instigated directly from Westminster, but I don't see any inclination or interest in doing that, presently anyway. Yeah. And on the Civic Forum, I think Helen can probably say more, but I will say that recent arguments about reviving it and bringing it back, which there's a legal mechanism to do, it wouldn't require legislation, it could just be brought back, have been met with complaints that it's too expensive and also unrepresentative. Even though it hasn't sat since 2002, so yeah.
Yeah, just on the Civic Forum, it wasn't welcome in the Good Friday Agreement. It was hard fought for and put in, and there hasn't been any resources put towards it, and it hasn't been fully inclusive. So the trade union movement was very heavily involved in bringing us towards the Good Friday Agreement, and their voices were taken out of it. So it, as Elaine said, it wouldn't take much to put it back there. But the way we are operating now on a two-party state, it's the majority of the voices that get heard, so it's very hard for people to take part in that.
Yeah, I think some sort of mechanism needs to happen to ensure that the voices of marginalised people are heard. So women, disabled people, immigrants, people who've come from other countries, traveller backgrounds, and so on. And they're the people who often aren't confident or aren't involved in the mainstream politics that do all the shouting, some would describe it, even though I'm talking about my own, situation. But yeah, no, I think it's very important that, this committee has been looking at ways of what constitutional change will mean and what's the best way to ensure all voices are heard. And I think we need, voices. We need mechanisms on the ground where people feel comfortable about speaking about what actually unites them and what the real issues are on the ground and that affect them, because I think they'll find there's a lot more, in common, a lot more commonality across sectors than division. I know you talk about your women's centres and the important work they do, and and I appreciate that. They are, I presume, cross-community, or is there opposition to them being cross-community? Or
no, they would be set in areas of possibly high deprivation. So there are some women's centres who would be set in single identity areas, because of that's the area that they have. But the women's centres all work together. So that's part of what Reclaim the Agenda would do, is make sure that there is that connectivity. So we come together on issues around poverty, on issues around childcare. And as you say, there is more that they have in common than we have. We have some challenging conversations over the years, particularly around access to abortion. And centres that were totally opposed to that came round because it was about a rights-based thing. Okay. So we're not all singing from the same sheet all the time, but we are all talking, we all are working towards what is hopefully going to be a better future for our children. So the designation of when you arrive at Stormont as an MLA, it's designated as nationalist or unionist. Yeah. So no other voices really get through on that. It's the majority that rules, and that plays out in councils as well. So a lot of funding that councils would have, and its majority rule, it's going to their own people and not actually seeking outside of that. So there is more people now that are disenfranchised and removed really from the whole access to political life or access to taking part in social and cultural that are being excluded. And of course we have all of our new migrant communities that are further excluded again.
I know, yeah.
So we have some women's centres who would have, some of them would have up to 22 different nationalities attending their centre, and they would be in an area of a high deprivation, and they don't get any extra funding to accommodate that. And it does put the local people that have been using the centre, it puts them a wee bit out of joint as well. So they're doing a lot in terms of keeping the peace there with racial equality, and a lot of them are still fighting paramilitary involvement as well. That has not gone away.
Just to find, I think education is such a key, and the fact that there's still segregated education is a big mess, because if you put children in a room, they don't care what colour your skin is or what religion you have or whatever. If they're not actually, if they're left alone, left to do their own thing, and I think that's the best way, would be a more integrated education system and build from the bottom up.
I totally agree, and I think one of the issues that we have with integrated education is not just that there isn't enough available to meet demand, but also is that significant investment in that sector needs to happen, and we have an additional layer of segregation around class, because we have, the sort of grammar school system was originally intended, well intended, when it came in the 1960s to open up quote unquote better schools to those from working class backgrounds who scored well in what was known as the 11+, and is now known as the transfer test. But there's now, it's gone a long way since the 1960s, and now there's a degree of sort of coaching and what we would call, I'm originally from Cavan, what we would call south of the border grinds, to get children through those tests, which they take, I should say, at the age of 10 years old, to get into the better schools. And then there's a system associated with how well those schools are considered when it comes to, I suppose, doing well later in your career. The classism present around school and education is such that it simply isn't in the Republic, where I know there's obviously private schools, and of course we have sort of private schools as well, but those are a very small minority. Most people go to schools of mixed ability, and the name of your school doesn't necessarily convey anything about where you live, the kind of house you live in, and the kind of estate you might grow up on. So you can go a lot further in life without anybody knowing what kind of background you came from. The same doesn't really transfer over in the north, where the kind of class division is very clear in terms of where somebody went to secondary school more often than not, in a way that it just wasn't intended to do, but now it almost universally does.